A soldier came home after months away, his loyal K9 Shadow by his side, expecting a quiet summer night. But then, a piercing scream cut through the silence. Shadow barked wildly as Ethan rushed inside, and there, in the dim light, his little girl sat trembling, crying, her tiny hands clutching her empty stomach. What he saw next would shatter his world and change everything. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer night in Cedar Springs, Texas, was thick with heat, the air heavy with cicadas humming in the distance. The faint scent of freshly cut grass clung to the breeze as a dim moon hung low above the quiet suburban street. It should have been peaceful, but for Ethan Cole, nothing about this night felt calm. Ethan, a 38-year-old former Navy SEAL, had spent 8 grueling months at a special training camp in California. He had the rugged, weathered look of a man who had seen too much. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp jawlines partly hidden beneath a short layer of stubble. His dark brown hair, trimmed neatly, framed a face marked by sleepless nights and battles fought long before. His piercing steel-gray eyes carried a constant heaviness, a reflection of both his military discipline and the lingering shadows of PTSD. He wasn't the same man who had left this house months ago. War had carved something permanent into him, a quiet caution that never faded. Beside him padded Shadow, his loyal 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, a massive muscular dog with a glossy black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes. Shadow had saved Ethan's life in Iraq, twice, and since then they had been inseparable. Shadow's ears twitched at every sound, his body always slightly tense, trained to sense danger before Ethan could. As Ethan pulled into the narrow driveway of his modest suburban home, he felt his pulse quicken. It had been nearly 3 months since he last hugged his daughter, Lily Cole, and tonight he wanted nothing more than to hold her again. But as soon as he stepped out of the truck, Shadow stiffened, hackles raised slightly, and let out a low growl. Ethan frowned. The house looked familiar, but wrong. The soft glow of warm yellow light spilled from the windows, yet there was a strange scent in the air, lavender and lemon, a fragrance Ethan didn't use. He stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the wooden boards, and retrieved the spare key from beneath the porch light where he always hid it. The door creaked softly as it opened, and a wave of artificial freshness hit him. Inside, the living room was spotless, almost too perfect. The couch had been reupholstered, the rug replaced, and a candle burned steadily on the dining table. Ethan's chest tightened. Months away, and already his home felt foreign. He set his rain-stained backpack near the door and ran a hand through his damp hair, taking a deep breath to steady himself. From the kitchen, a soft voice called out, "Ethan!" Diana Reed, Ethan's wife of 2 years, appeared, wiping her hands on a pale apron. Diana, 28, was tall and slender, with shoulder-length chestnut hair that caught the light and pale, smooth skin untouched by the sun. Her green eyes carried a polite softness, but beneath it lingered something guarded, something unreadable. Ethan had met her 2 years after his first wife, Emily's mother, died tragically in a car accident. Back then, Diana had worked at a small coffee shop near the base, cheerful and warm, her presence a kind of fragile comfort to a broken man. But time and silence had changed her. "I didn't think you'd be back tonight," she said, her tone even, almost rehearsed. "Got early leave," Ethan replied, his voice low, gruff from exhaustion. "Thought I'd surprise you." Diana smiled faintly. "Lily will be thrilled. She played all day, wore herself out. She's asleep now." Ethan's eyes scanned the room quickly. No toys scattered, no little shoes by the door, no stuffed animals draped over the couch. All signs of Lily's presence? Missing. It was too clean, too silent. He nodded slowly but didn't respond, his gaze shifting toward the stairs. Shadow followed his movements, ears perked, tail stiff, every muscle tense. Ethan climbed the first step quietly, then paused. From the landing, he glanced back. Diana stood motionless in the hallway, one hand resting lightly on the wall, her expression unreadable. The hallway upstairs was dark, silent, heavy with heat. Ethan reached Lily's door. It was closed, no sound coming from inside. He placed a hand on the knob, hesitated for a heartbeat, and that's when it happened. A scream, high-pitched, piercing, Lily's voice. "Daddy!" Ethan's heart stopped, then exploded into motion. Without thinking, he rammed his shoulder into the door, but it held firm, locked from the inside. Shadow barked sharply, claws scraping against the floor. Ethan stepped back, drew in a deep breath, and kicked hard beneath the handle. The door swung open with a violent crack. Light from the hallway spilled into the room, cutting through the shadows. In the corner, Lily Cole, his 5-year-old daughter, sat curled into a trembling ball, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her blonde curls were damp with sweat, sticking to her pale cheeks streaked with tears. Her oversized nightgown clung to her small frame, wrinkled and twisted as though she had been thrashing. A faint red mark stood out sharply on her left cheek. Fresh. Recent. Standing just 2 steps away was Diana, her chest rising and falling quickly, a small pillow still clutched in her right hand. Her green eyes widened in shock as Ethan entered, but her voice caught in her throat. For a moment, no one moved. Ethan's body went cold. His instincts screamed to protect Lily, but his mind swirled with confusion and dread. He dropped to his knees beside her, reaching out slowly, his voice trembling. "Baby, it's me. Daddy's here." Lily flinched slightly at his touch, but didn't pull away, her wide hazel eyes staring past him, vacant, distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Behind him, Shadow growled low, ears pinned, tail stiff as stone, his body angled protectively between Ethan and Diana. "Ethan, Diana began, her voice sharp and shaky. She slipped. I was just—" Ethan didn't answer. His arms wrapped gently around Lily, his mind racing, his chest tight with dread. The smell of lavender and lemon filled his lungs, but all he could focus on was the soft, muffled sound of Lily's sobs against his shoulder. In that moment, Ethan knew one thing. Something was deeply wrong in this house. Ethan held Lily close, feeling her tiny frame tremble in his arms, her shallow breaths brushing against his neck. Her skin was cool, damp with tears, and every soft whimper that escaped her lips cut deeper into his chest. Shadow padded silently beside him, the dog's claws clicking lightly against the wooden floor, his ears flicking at the slightest sound. Together, they made their way downstairs to the living room where the air was warmer, less suffocating than the heavy silence upstairs. Ethan gently set Lily down on the couch, wrapping her in the thick cream-colored blanket he'd bought her last winter. She curled into herself instinctively, pulling the fabric close, her wide hazel eyes still glassy with fear. Shadow lay near her feet, his large body curled protectively, his sharp amber eyes never leaving Diana, who lingered quietly at the bottom of the stairs. Ethan walked into the kitchen, his boots heavy against the tiles, and opened the refrigerator. He frowned immediately. The shelf where he always kept Lily's special lactose-free milk was empty. In fact, several other familiar items were missing. The small owl-shaped plastic cup Lily always used, the stack of little yogurt packs she loved, even the blueberries she had begged for before he left for training. Ethan shut the door slowly, forcing his breathing to remain steady, his knuckles white against the fridge handle. When he returned to the couch, he sat next to Lily, gently tucking a stray golden curl behind her ear. "Sweetheart," he whispered softly, "did something happen while Daddy was away?" Lily didn't answer, her small lips pressed tightly together, her little hands buried under the blanket. Her silence spoke louder than words. Ethan carefully pulled her closer and reached for her sleeve. As he rolled up the soft cotton fabric, his chest tightened. Dark purple bruises marred her small wrist, some fading into yellow, others newer and raw. He slowly checked her other arm and found more along her forearm, faint but unmistakable. A knot of dread twisted deep in his stomach. "What happened here, Lily?" he asked gently, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. Before Lily could respond, Diana's voice came from behind him, her tone quick, defensive. "She fell, Ethan. Down the stairs last week," she said, stepping closer, her slender frame stiff beneath her pale pink blouse. Her chestnut brown hair was loosely tied back, framing her delicate face that now wore a mask of forced calm. "She's always been sensitive. A little bruise looks worse on her skin. You know that." Ethan turned to face her fully, his steel-gray gaze sharp. "Sensitive?" he repeated, his voice low but heavy. Diana crossed her arms, avoiding his eyes. She plays too hard sometimes. Trips, bumps into things. It's nothing serious. Shadow, lying between them, let out a low rumble, his head lifting, ears pinned slightly forward. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back to calm him, though the tension in the room was palpable. "Go to bed, Diana," Ethan said evenly after a moment, his voice quiet but firm. She hesitated, her green eyes searching his face, then turned and walked away without another word, her footsteps soft against the hallway floor. Ethan waited until her door clicked shut before turning his attention back to Lily. He pulled the blanket tighter around her, his thumb brushing away a stray tear on her cheek. Shadow shifted closer, resting his large head gently against Lily's knees. Slowly, the girl reached out and buried her tiny fingers into the soft fur behind Shadow's ears. It was the first time she moved on her own since the scream. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Ethan carried Lily upstairs. Instead of taking her to her own room, he brought her into his. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast warm light over the neatly made bed, the faint hum of cicadas seeping in through the window. He laid her down gently, adjusting the blanket so it tucked securely under her chin. Shadow circled once before curling up at the side of the bed, his eyes half closed, but his ears twitching at every small creak and sigh of the house. Ethan sat at the edge of the mattress, staring at the shadows on the wall. Every instinct inside him screamed that something was wrong, that Lily's bruises weren't accidents, but his rational mind struggled against the dread curling in his chest. He wanted to believe Diana's words, but his gut, sharpened by years of battlefield survival, refused to. For a long time, Ethan lay awake, one hand resting protectively on Lily's back as she breathed softly against the pillow. Shadow remained still, his body tense, guarding the room like a silent sentinel. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted softly. The world outside was quiet, but inside Ethan's heart, storms were gathering. Storms he knew he would have to face, no matter how painful the answers might be. The next morning, sunlight spilled lazily through the half-open blinds, filling the small bedroom with a pale warmth that contrasted sharply with the heaviness inside Ethan's chest. Lily lay curled against him, her tiny breath steady but shallow, clinging to his t-shirt even in sleep. Shadow, ever alert, lifted his head when Ethan stirred, amber eyes bright and watchful. It had been a long, restless night. Ethan didn't remember closing his eyes once, his thoughts circling endlessly around the bruises on Lily's arms and the faint red mark still visible on her cheek. He couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut, a warning carved deep into him by years of survival. By 7:30 a.m., the house stirred awake. Ethan dressed Lily in a soft pale blue sundress and tied her curls into a loose ponytail, trying his best to smile though his eyes were heavy. Lily clutched her worn teddy bear, its fur matted and faded, one button eye missing, and stayed silent as he led her downstairs. Diana stood by the kitchen counter, sipping coffee from a porcelain mug, dressed immaculately in a fitted white blouse and dark trousers, as though nothing had happened the night before. Her expression was carefully composed, but her green eyes flicked toward Ethan when she said softly, "You're taking her to school?" "Yes," Ethan replied shortly, adjusting Lily's small backpack on his shoulder. "She hasn't missed a day since I left. I don't see why she should now." Diana didn't argue, but her fingers tightened briefly around the mug handle before she turned away. Ricky sat slouched at the table, his lanky 15-year-old frame hunched over a bowl of cereal. With messy dark brown hair falling into his sharp, narrow face and a permanent scowl that made him look older than his age, Ricky exuded a quiet defiance. His pale skin was marred by a faint scar under his right jaw. Something Ethan had learned came from a bike accident years ago, though Ricky wore it like a badge of rebellion. Shadow's ears flattened the moment Ricky moved, a soft growl rumbling low in his throat. Ricky shot the dog a sideways glance, smirking slightly. "Still training your attack, mutt?" he muttered under his breath. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he ignored the comment, focusing instead on Lily, who clung closer to his side. Without another word, he grabbed the truck keys and led her outside. The drive to Cedar Springs Early Learning Center, Lily's preschool, was quiet except for the low hum of the engine. The warm Texas morning had already begun to heat the air, cicadas buzzing faintly in the distance. Lily stared out the window, her little hands gripping her teddy so tightly the seams strained. Ethan glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the way her hazel eyes flicked nervously every time a car horn blared or Shadow barked softly at passing strangers. When they arrived, Ethan parked by the low red brick building surrounded by a white picket fence and patches of blooming daisies. Children ran across the small playground inside, their laughter rising above the chirping birds, but Lily stayed close to Ethan, her steps hesitant. Inside the classroom, bright murals of rainbows and cartoon animals covered the walls, and rows of tiny cubbies lined the entrance. A young woman approached, her gentle smile framed by strands of sandy blonde hair that fell neatly over her shoulders. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, offering her hand. "I'm Bethany Hughes, Lily's teacher." Bethany, 27 years old, was petite and warm, with kind hazel eyes behind thin rectangular glasses. She wore a pastel green cardigan over a floral dress, her voice carrying the calm steadiness of someone who worked with children daily. But as she crouched slightly to greet Lily, her expression shifted subtly, a flicker of concern replacing her smile when she noticed the faint marks along Lily's wrist. "She's been quieter than usual," Bethany said after a pause, lowering her voice as she straightened up to face Ethan. "She used to laugh so much, but lately she sits alone, drawing. She doesn't play with the others. When we ask her questions, she barely answers." Ethan's stomach nodded as he crouched to meet Lily's gaze. "Sweetheart," he whispered gently, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, "do you want to tell me something? Anything?" Lily bit her lower lip, her small shoulders tense. She shook her head once, then paused. Slowly she leaned closer, her voice barely audible, no louder than a trembling breath. "Daddy, I'm scared of Ricky, and the monster under the bed." Ethan froze, his steel gray eyes hardening, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "The monster?" he asked softly. Lily nodded, tears glimmering in her lashes, but she said no more, tucking her chin into the worn Teddy's fur. Shadow, sitting obediently at Ethan's side, nudged her leg gently with his nose, as if to reassure her. Bethany frowned slightly, folding her hands together. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "kids often express fear through stories, but when the fear is this strong, it usually points to something deeper. I don't know what's happening, but Lily's drawings—" She hesitated, glancing at the stack of papers on a nearby table. Ethan followed her gaze. Among the crayon sketches was one that made his chest tighten. Lily had drawn a figure under a bed, black scribbles tangled around it like shadows, while a small girl with tear-streaked cheeks crouched in the corner. "She wouldn't explain this one," Bethany said quietly. Ethan took the drawing gently, sliding it into Lily's backpack without a word. Back at the truck, Ethan buckled Lily in and glanced at Shadow, whose ears remained perked and alert. The dog had been restless since the previous night, his instincts sharper than usual. As Ethan started the engine, his thoughts swirled. The bruises, the missing milk, the silence, Ricky's smirk, and now, Lily's whispers about monsters. When they returned home, the sound of video games echoed faintly from the living room. Ricky, sprawled on the couch, controller in hand. Shadow's body tensed immediately, his lips curling slightly to reveal the edge of sharp teeth. Ricky paused the game, leaning back with a lazy grin. "What?" he drawled, glancing at Ethan. "Dog looks like he wants to bite me. Better keep him leashed." Ethan ignored him, but he watched closely. He noticed how Lily clung tighter to his hand, hiding partially behind his leg, her hazel eyes wide and fearful whenever Ricky's gaze shifted toward her. The warning signs were stacking, each one heavier than the last. Ethan could feel it now. Something was deeply wrong inside this house. Shadow sensed it too. And for the first time, Ethan stopped trying to convince himself otherwise. That night, the house was wrapped in silence, but Ethan Cole didn't sleep. He lay still in bed, one arm draped protectively over Lily, who was nestled close against his chest, breathing softly. Shadow lay curled on the floor by the doorway, his amber eyes half open, body tense, every muscle ready to react. Ethan kept his breathing steady, pretending to drift into sleep, but his ears strained against the silence, waiting. Something inside told him tonight would reveal more than anyone wanted him to know. Just after midnight, faint creaks stirred from the hallway. Ethan opened his eyes, but didn't move. He heard the soft, deliberate steps of Ricky. A few seconds later came Ricky's low whisper, carrying into Lily's room like a cold breeze. "If you tell anyone, the monster under the bed will bite your legs off." Lily whimpered faintly, burying her face into her teddy bear, the sound slicing through Ethan like broken glass. Then Shadow growled. Low, sharp, dangerous. Ethan sat up instantly, his instincts roaring to life. He rose silently from the bed, his tall, broad frame moving through the shadows with a soldier's precision. Shadow padded behind him, hackles raised, claws tapping softly against the wood. He stepped into the hallway, and the faint yellow glow from the bathroom spilled into the darkness. What he saw made his stomach twist into knots. Lily stood by the sink, her tiny arms red and raw, scrubbing her hands beneath the cold running water until the skin looked rubbed thin, almost bleeding. Her curls clung damply to her cheeks, her shoulders trembling under her pale cotton nightgown. Beside her stood Ricky, leaning casually against the doorframe, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You missed a spot," Ricky sneered, pointing lazily toward her wrist. "Gotta scrub harder. Monsters hate dirt, right?" Ethan's fists clenched, his breathing sharp. He stepped forward quickly, placing himself between Ricky and Lily, kneeling to pull her hands gently away from the sink. Shadow moved into position beside him, lips curled, a low rumble vibrating deep in his chest. Lily clung to Ethan, silent, her tears soaking into his t-shirt. Ricky's grin faltered, but he straightened his lanky frame, tilting his head with mock defiance. "It was just a joke," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She believes in monsters. I was playing along." Before Ethan could respond, Diana appeared at the end of the hallway, wearing a silk robe, her chestnut brown hair messy from sleep. Her green eyes widened at the scene, Lily trembling, Shadow snarling softly, Ricky leaning smugly against the wall. "What's going on here?" she demanded, crossing the hallway toward them. "She's fine," Ricky said quickly, his voice higher now, defensive. "I was joking. She takes everything too seriously." Diana's gaze darted between Ethan and Ricky, her expression tightening. "He didn't mean harm," she said, her voice softer now, as though coaxing Ethan into backing down. "He's a teenager, Ethan. Boys tease." Ethan stood slowly, his steel-gray eyes hard as iron. "This isn't teasing." Silence stretched between them, thick and tense. Finally, Diana looked away first, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her lips pressed tight. Ricky muttered something under his breath and stormed back to his room, slamming the door behind him. Ethan said nothing. He scooped Lily into his arms, her small body shaking, and carried her back to his room. Shadow followed closely, glancing over his shoulder at Diana, who stood frozen in the hallway, pale and unreadable. When the door closed, Ethan sat Lily on the bed, wiping the wetness from her tiny hands with a towel. She wouldn't meet his eyes, her curls falling like a curtain around her pale face. Shadow placed his head gently on her lap, nuzzling her wrist until her fingers finally buried into his thick fur. Ethan's chest ached. The bruises, the terror, the whispers about monsters. None of this was normal, and every instinct in him screamed that Ricky wasn't acting alone. That night, Ethan sat by the window, staring into the dark yard beyond the glass, his mind racing through possibilities. His years of training in the Navy had taught him one thing: instincts don't lie. Something was happening in this house, something Diana wasn't telling him. He knew he couldn't confront her directly, not yet. Without proof, any accusation could backfire. By 2 a.m., Ethan grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he stopped at a name he hadn't called in years: Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was 42. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-browned skin and a closely shaved head. Years of work in military intelligence had carved deep lines into his weathered face. Marcus was once Ethan's closest friend in the SEALs, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail and an unshakable calm under pressure. But when an operation overseas went wrong, costing 3 men their lives, Marcus had resigned, choosing to work privately in security and surveillance consulting. Despite his rough past, he was fiercely loyal to those he trusted, and Ethan was one of the few. Marcus answered on the second ring, his deep voice steady. "Cole, it's been a while." Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, "I need your help. My little girl, something's happening. I can't prove it yet." Marcus didn't ask questions. "I'll bring what you need: cameras, mics, encrypted storage. But listen, Ethan, once we start this, there's no turning back." Ethan glanced at Lily, finally asleep against Shadow's side, her teddy clutched tightly to her chest. "I know," he said softly. 2 days later, Marcus arrived in Cedar Springs, his black pickup rumbling into the driveway just after dusk. He wore a simple charcoal t-shirt and jeans, but his military posture remained sharp, his movements precise. Shadow barked once, then wagged his tail, remembering Marcus from years before, when the German Shepherd had trained alongside both men. Inside the living room, Marcus unpacked his gear. Tiny pinhole cameras disguised as screws, wireless mics the size of coins, and a central receiver capable of storing encrypted audio and video. Ethan watched silently, his jaw tight, while Marcus crouched to slide a device beneath the wooden staircase and another behind the vent near Lily's room. "Keep this quiet," Marcus warned softly, glancing toward the hallway where Diana's shadow passed briefly. "If anyone suspects, you lose the advantage." Ethan nodded once, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. By the time the last device was hidden, Marcus stood and clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "This isn't just about watching," he said. "It's about timing. We gather proof, then we move. Nothing else." Ethan stared at the soft flicker of the nightlight in the hallway, where Lily's small form had disappeared minutes ago. His chest tightened with silent resolve. He finally had a plan. Now, he just needed the truth. 3 days later, the weight of truth began to take shape inside Ethan's chest. The cameras Marcus installed had been silent observers, tucked carefully into the corners of Lily's room, the hallway, and the kitchen. Ethan sat in the dim light of his study, his steel-gray eyes locked on the small receiver in front of him. Shadow lay at his feet, ears flicking at every faint sound from upstairs, his amber gaze fixed on the door like a silent guardian. Marcus sat across from Ethan, his solid frame leaning forward, jaw tight, scanning the live feeds with military precision. The first video they reviewed was from the hallway camera. Diana's figure appeared, elegant as ever in a fitted blouse, her chestnut brown hair tied loosely at her neck. But her expression was ice. Her green eyes burned with frustration as she stood over Lily, her voice sharp and venomous. "You're useless. You can't even fold a blanket right. No wonder everyone pities you." Ethan clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, but Marcus lifted a hand without looking away from the screen, silently urging him to breathe. "Control it," Marcus murmured, his deep, even voice grounding him. "We need every second of this." The next clip made Shadow stir, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. In the video, Ricky was in the living room, towering over Lily's tiny frame, his lanky 15-year-old body hunched forward, messy dark brown hair falling into his sharp, pale face. "Pick it up," he snapped, kicking a pile of toys toward her. "And do it right, or the monster comes tonight." His voice dripped with a cruel edge. Lily, dressed in a faded pink t-shirt and gray leggings, knelt on the carpet silently, her small shoulders trembling as she stacked each toy with careful precision. Ethan's chest tightened, his breathing shallow. Every instinct screamed at him to storm downstairs and end it right then, but Marcus kept his hand steady on Ethan's arm. "Patience," he reminded him quietly. "Without full proof, they'll twist this against you." But it was the audio recording that broke him. The tiny microphone hidden beneath Lily's nightstand caught everything. Ricky's whisper came through the speaker, chilling and deliberate. "The monster will come if you talk to Dad. It'll bite your legs clean off." And then, Lily's muffled sob, soft, restrained, heartbreaking, as though she was trying not to let anyone hear. Ethan's vision blurred for a moment, his throat tight. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, steadying himself, as Marcus replayed the clip for confirmation. Shadow pressed his nose against Ethan's knee, sensing the sharp rise in his heartbeat, giving a soft whine as though reminding him to stay grounded. "This is it," Marcus said finally, his voice low and certain. "This is enough to prove psychological abuse, and possibly neglect. But we need to back it up. Twice, maybe 3 times. Nothing can go missing." Ethan nodded, exhaling slowly, his jaw set like stone. "Make the copies," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Together they encrypted the data, creating multiple backups stored on separate drives. Marcus, meticulous as ever, labeled one drive and locked it inside a small black case before slipping it into his bag. "I'll deliver a secure copy to CPS," Marcus said, referring to Child Protective Services, his expression unreadable beneath his neatly trimmed beard. and another goes into a safety deposit box at the bank. Even if Diana figures this out, she won't be able to destroy the evidence. Ethan stared at the blinking lights on the receiver, the weight of responsibility settling deep into his bones. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was preparing for war. That night, Ethan sat outside Lily's room, his back against the wall, Shadow lying across the threshold like a shield. Every time a floorboard creaked, Shadow's ears perked, and his amber eyes glimmered in the dim hallway light. Inside, Lily finally slept peacefully, her soft breathing steady beneath the pale pink blanket Ethan had tucked carefully around her. Hours passed. At one point, Diana walked quietly down the hallway, pausing for a moment at the edge of the light, her green eyes locking briefly with Ethan's. Neither of them spoke. She glanced toward Lily's door, then turned and disappeared into the shadows without a sound. Shadow followed her movement with a soft, warning rumble in his throat until she was gone. By dawn, the first copy of the recordings had been delivered to Marcus's secure contact at CPS. They couldn't intervene yet, but the evidence was growing, stacking layer by layer like bricks in a wall Ethan was building to protect his daughter. That evening, Marcus returned with new encrypted drives, helping Ethan rotate the backups and set up an automated upload to a private server. The two men worked in silence, their years of shared discipline guiding them through each step efficiently. As Marcus packed his gear, he glanced down the hallway toward Lily's room, where Shadow lay curled, a sentinel refusing to rest. "That dog's reading this house better than any camera," Marcus said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying a trace of admiration. "Trust him, Ethan. He'll warn you before the next storm hits." Ethan nodded without hesitation, resting a hand on Shadow's back, feeling the strength beneath the dog's thick black and tan fur. The storm was coming, but this time, Ethan would be ready. The morning air in Cedar Springs was heavy with the sticky heat of July, but inside Ethan's chest, the weight was colder than steel. He hadn't slept much, not after everything the recordings had revealed, and now he stood barefoot in the living room, holding Lily close against him. Her tiny hands clung tightly to his shirt, her cheek pressed against his collarbone, as though she sensed something big was about to happen. Shadow sat near the door, his muscular frame tense, ears perked, amber eyes sharp and focused like a soldier awaiting orders. At exactly 6:45 a.m., a convoy of two black SUVs rolled quietly into the narrow driveway. Out stepped Marcus Hale, tall and commanding as always, his simple gray t-shirt stretched over his broad shoulders, his dark jeans worn but neat. Behind him were three uniformed officers from the Texas Child Protective Services, CPS, each carrying thick folders and portable devices. Leading them was Officer Karen Maddox, a woman in her early 40s with a strong, athletic build, warm bronze skin, and a confident stride. Her short black hair was tucked under a fitted cap, and her sharp brown eyes softened slightly as she looked at Lily in Ethan's arms, but her voice remained steady, firm, and professional. "Mr. Cole," she said, flashing her badge, "we have an emergency child welfare check order, signed by Judge Evans under Texas statute." Ethan nodded once, his jaw tight but his voice calm. "I understand." The sound of heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. Ricky emerged first, messy dark brown hair sticking up, his lean teenage frame tense beneath a black hoodie. His pale skin flushed as his gaze darted between Ethan, Marcus, and the officers. "What's going on?" he demanded, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and arrogance. Behind him came Diana Reed, her slender frame wrapped in a silk robe, chestnut brown hair messy, her pale green eyes wild with confusion and panic. She held her arms tightly across her chest, as if bracing herself against an invisible storm. "What is this?" she snapped, stepping forward sharply. "You can't just barge into our home." Officer Maddox handed her the official order, her tone steady but unyielding. "Ma'am, we're authorized by court approval. We need full cooperation." Diana scanned the paper, her lips trembling faintly. But then she lifted her chin and forced a calmness into her voice that didn't reach her eyes. "This is insane," she hissed, turning toward Ethan. "You're behind this, aren't you?" Ethan's steel-gray gaze didn't waver. "This is about Lily." The tension in the room thickened. Shadow growled low, his body angled protectively toward Ethan and Lily, his amber eyes locked on Ricky, who stood frozen near the hallway wall. Officer Maddox signaled to one of her colleagues, Detective Alan Whitaker, A man in his late 30s with broad shoulders, sandy blonde hair cropped short, and a clean-shaven face etched with faint worry lines. Whitaker's calm demeanor contrasted with his sharp, calculating blue eyes. He had worked dozens of child protection cases before and knew how quickly situations like this could spiral. "Ma'am, we'll need you and your son to sit down," Whitaker said firmly, motioning toward the couch. "We have questions." Diana's voice rose in pitch as she tightened her robe around herself. "You think I hurt her? You think I'd do that to her?" Marcus stepped forward, his presence steady but commanding. "We have video and audio recordings, Diana," he said evenly, his voice like a quiet storm. "Multiple hours. This isn't speculation anymore." The words hit like a blow. Diana froze, her green eyes flashing between Ethan and Marcus before narrowing into something colder. Not fear, but calculation. Ricky, however, faltered. His hands trembled slightly as he shoved them into the front pocket of his hoodie, avoiding everyone's gaze. When Officer Maddox turned to him gently, softening her tone just slightly, he broke. "I didn't mean it," Ricky muttered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I thought if I scared her, she wouldn't talk. I didn't know it'd get this bad." "Ricky," Maddox said calmly, crouching slightly so her brown eyes met his level. "Did you threaten Lily? Did you tell her about the monster?" Ricky swallowed hard, his messy hair falling into his pale, tense face. "Yeah," he whispered, barely audible. "I said the monster would come if she told Dad." Ethan's grip on Lily tightened, but Marcus placed a steadying hand on his shoulder before he could step forward. Diana gasped sharply, spinning toward Ricky. "You idiot!" she hissed under her breath, her voice cutting like glass. Officer Maddox straightened slowly, her calm professionalism hiding a restrained urgency. She glanced at Whitaker, who gave a subtle nod. "Ma'am," Maddox said, turning back to Diana, "we're placing you under temporary custody pending further investigation." "You can't do this!" Diana screamed, her voice cracking now, no longer smooth or composed. "I didn't do anything. He's lying. They're all lying." Her green eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape, but the officers moved quickly, surrounding her without aggression, but with practiced precision. Shadow barked sharply, tail stiff, as the officers secured the scene. Ricky slumped into the couch, pale and silent now, his earlier defiance extinguished by the weight of reality. Outside, the July sun climbed higher, casting long beams of light across the driveway where the SUVs waited. Ethan stepped onto the porch, holding Lily close against his chest. Her tiny hand clutched his shirt, face pressed into his neck, her small body trembling but silent. Shadow sat beside them, head high, posture rigid, watching every movement with protective intent. From behind, Marcus spoke softly. "It's over for now, Ethan." Ethan nodded faintly, his steel-gray gaze fixed on the street beyond, where one of the officers led Diana toward the vehicle. Ricky followed behind another officer, shoulders hunched, his hoodie pulled low. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something close to relief. But beneath that fragile calm, a deep ache remained, carved by the truth of what Lily had endured. He kissed the top of her head, whispering quietly, "You're safe now, sweetheart. I promise." Shadow pressed against his leg, the living shield he had always been. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Ethan felt they had won a small victory. The sun hung high over Cedar Springs, its golden light washing the small Texas town in the warmth of midsummer. The breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers from the lake's edge, mixing with the earthy aroma of pine trees. It had been 3 long months since the morning Diana was led away in handcuffs and Ricky was placed under court supervision. The house that had once been heavy with shadows now felt lighter, almost unfamiliar in its stillness. For Ethan Cole, however, silence had never been so comforting. Ethan stood on the porch of a modest lakefront cabin he'd recently rented, gazing across the rippling water that shimmered under the July sun. The cabin was small, 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a worn wooden deck that faced the lake. But to Ethan, it was more than a house. It was a sanctuary. He rested his hands on the railing, the steel gray in his eyes softening as the wind brushed against his face. His broad shoulders, once hunched with exhaustion and tension, carried themselves differently now, though the faint stubble on his jaw and the deep lines beneath his eyes revealed scars that time alone couldn't erase. Shadow sat at his feet, the 6-year-old German shepherd majestic as ever, his thick black and tan coat gleaming under the sunlight. His amber eyes scanned the surroundings constantly, ears flicking at every chirp and rustle, still every bit the trained protector. But here, his movements were calmer, more relaxed. Lily had taken to calling him our hero, and he wore the title as naturally as his harness. From inside the cabin came the soft sound of laughter, a sound Ethan thought he'd never hear again. Lily, now 5.5, sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, her curls catching the sunlight streaming in from the open windows. Her cheeks, once pale and hollow, now glowed a healthy pink, and though her hazel eyes still held a touch of fragility, they sparkled more often than they had in months. In her hands, she clutched a box of crayons, carefully selecting one to add to the picture in front of her. Ethan stepped inside quietly, leaning down to glance at her drawing. A house with a red-tiled roof stood beneath a bright yellow sun. In the yard, a tall man with brown hair stood beside a little girl with curls and a German shepherd drawn proudly at their side. Around them were flowers, the lake, and rays of summer light stretching across the page. "Looks just like us," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside her. Lily grinned shyly, holding up the crayon in her small fingers. "It is us, Daddy," she whispered. "I made it sunny because Shadow likes when it's warm." Ethan chuckled quietly, ruffling her curls gently. "I think you like it too." A week earlier, the court had delivered its verdict. Ethan remembered sitting in the wooden courtroom, the cold weight of months-long anxiety heavy in his chest. Judge Parker, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and a voice calm but firm, presided over the case. After reviewing the recordings and testimonies, the decision had been clear. Diana Reed was sentenced to 4 years in prison for child abuse and neglect, the green in her eyes gone pale as the words fell from the judge's lips. Ricky Morgan, at 15, was sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention with supervised probation afterward. The room had been silent when the ruling was delivered. Ethan remembered looking down at Lily in his lap, her tiny fingers gripping his hand tightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could whisper the words he'd been holding back. "It's over, sweetheart." Marcus Hale had been there too, leaning against the wall at the back of the courtroom. With his tall, commanding frame and clean-shaven head, Marcus radiated the same quiet strength he always had. When Ethan stepped outside into the sunlight after the verdict, Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," Marcus said simply. "You gave her life back." Ethan had nodded, his voice rough when he answered. "I couldn't have done it without you." Marcus offered a rare smile. "That's what brothers are for." The transition to their new life by the lake wasn't easy at first. Lily had nightmares in the beginning, soft cries in the middle of the night that would jolt Ethan awake instantly. Shadow always reacted first, leaping onto the bed, curling his warm body close to Lily until her breathing slowed and her small hand rested against his fur. Over time, the dreams came less often, and the house slowly filled with new routines: morning walks by the lake, afternoons spent painting on the porch, evenings with the soft hum of cicadas outside the windows. One evening, as the golden hour stretched across the water, Ethan sat on the deck with Marcus, who had stopped by to visit before leaving town for another security assignment. The two men sipped coffee from mismatched mugs, Shadow sprawled lazily at their feet. "She's smiling again," Marcus observed, watching Lily twirl barefoot in the yard, her curls bouncing as she laughed. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze soft. "I didn't think I'd hear that sound again." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his weathered face calm but thoughtful. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan. The past doesn't disappear, but you're giving her something better now. That's what matters." Ethan glanced at his friend, the gratitude unspoken but understood. "Thank you," he said simply. By late August, the days had grown longer, stretching into slow warm evenings scented with honeysuckle. Lily no longer clung to Ethan quite so tightly when they walked by the water. Sometimes, she even ran ahead with Shadow bounding beside her, his tail swishing happily as the two disappeared momentarily into the tall grass before circling back, laughing and barking all at once. One night, as the last rays of sunlight painted the lake gold, Lily climbed into Ethan's lap on the porch swing, her teddy bear hugged close to her chest. "Daddy?" she whispered softly. "Yes, sweetheart?" She looked up at him, her hazel eyes glowing beneath the fading light. Are we safe now? Ethan kissed the top of her head, holding her close, his voice steady but warm. Yes, Lily, we're safe. And we're home. Shadow settled beside them, his powerful frame resting against Ethan's legs, the soft sound of crickets filling the quiet night. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan believed his own words. Sometimes, life takes us through storms we never expected. Ethan, Lily, and Shadow's story reminds us that even in our darkest hours, miracles still exist. Sometimes in the form of courage, sometimes in the form of love, and sometimes through the quiet ways God guides us home. When Ethan thought he had lost everything, a single choice, to fight for his daughter, to protect her, became the turning point that saved them both. And maybe, just maybe, that was God's way of showing that hope is never truly gone. Just like Ethan and Lily, we all face battles in our everyday lives, moments of fear, heartbreak, and uncertainty. But this story reminds us that we are never walking alone. God's grace is with us, giving us strength when we feel weak and light when all we see is darkness. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can feel its message of hope. Drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more heartfelt stories like this one. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He give you strength to face your storms, faith to overcome them, and the comfort of knowing you are never alone.